In the case of Keith Johnson versus the province of Ontario, I hereby find you guilty of first-degree murder. I'm innocent. I'm innocent, and you'll all see. You'll all see.
10 years later.
I can't believe he's innocent. Judge is not gonna like this. Man, life has been rough ever since that last case. But at least Keith Johnson is still guilty. I have that. I don't have my wife and kids because she left. But, it is what it is, I guess. What's this? In the case of Keith Johnson? Oh, shit. Our ethical issue is capital punishment. Capital punishment is the act of killing individuals who are deemed guilty of crimes such as espionage, treason, and murder. But should those who have been convicted as guilty receive the death penalty if the crime is not heinous enough? What if the executed person actually turns out to be innocent? Is the deterrent effect of capital punishment worth the executions? Is the torturous method of capital punishment worth the pain and the cost? Do those who plea and are convicted of criminal insanity also deserve the death penalty? The opposition might suggest that capital punishment can be and should be used for deterrent for crime properties, the fact that it can bring relief to the family of victims and it may satisfy their demand of justice. Our position, on the other hand, is that capital punishment should not be used as it makes society more cruel. Being guilty can be reversed while capital punishment cannot, and is very costly and ineffective, and it seeks to control people rather than to deter them.
Welcome to the anti-capital punishment side. Now, I know what you're thinking. How do we find out that we're right? Well, there's only one answer, and that is to find people who are wrong. So here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna search for some strangers and interview them. And they're definitely gonna be strangers, not just my family. Okay, stranger number one. So, what are your views on capital punishment? Are you pro or against? Say pro.
Pro.
Very good, very good. This is exactly what we were looking for. Now, why are you for capital punishment? Is it because you believe that it acts as a deterrent?
Yes.
Yes, say yes. There we go. So, but wouldn't that be a false cause fallacy? Because statistics actually show that in states in America that have the death penalty, murder rate is actually higher than not. In contrast, where homelessness has increased, there's also higher rate of crime. So, your idea here is a false cause fallacy because what you believe in doesn't actually correlate to the truth. So, are you still pro capital punishment?
Yes, I am.
People have different opinions. That's good. Neat. Definite stranger number two. Hello. How are you? We're reporting on news. We're reporting for a pro and con capital punishment. Would you say you're for or against the death penalty?
Definitely for it.
For it. Perfect. Perfect. Would you say you're for it because you believe that the family of the victims deserve retribution as proportional punishment? Yes. Perfect. Perfect. See, this is exactly what we need. But wouldn't you say that that's actually a straw man fallacy? As it oversimplifies the situation. For example, what happens if someone murders in self-defense? Like there was a famous case in Canada where David Chen, an owner of a store, he did a citizen's arrest on a returning thief. But actually, he was charged with kidnapping of the thief and endangerment with a weapon. If he had hurt the thief or murdered him while he was trying to escape, David Chen would have been he was put on trial, but he would have been put on trial for murder. Your argument doesn't consider the cases like David Chen, and instead it oversimplifies the situation that all criminals are deserving of the death penalty if that crime was committed, and if they're convicted of guilty. This is why your argument is a strawman fallacy. So, are you for or against capital punishment?
No.
So you're for it. Okay, perfect. So why would you say that you're for capital punishment?
What does that mean?
Oh, so you think that the solution to all reoffending criminals is capital punishment? Well, that's actually a composition fallacy. You wanna know why? It's because you're putting all criminals into the same spot. There's only 50% of criminals who reoffend. That means we'd be executing 50% of criminals who try to not reoffend later in their lives after their imprisonment is over. Right? Both Canada and America, the charge for murder is life imprisonment, so most people aren't even getting the chance to reoffend. Secondly, wouldn't a less harsh system be more beneficial to criminals who are forced to reoffend? As many people, after having a criminal record, aren't able to find certain jobs and their life ends up becoming much harder. This also increases their chance to reoffend. So what you're saying is a composition fallacy because it categorizes all criminals into one single person instead of showing that not everybody is. Mr. Ender, do you still believe in capital punishment?
No.
Very good, very good. Thank you very much. So, it seems that most people who believed in capital punishment at first had many fallacies in their argument. Is this a coincidence? I think not. Let me tell you why.
Argument number 1. Capital punishment is unethical because of the high percentage of cases that have been discovered to have been wrongful convictions of innocent people, some who have been executed before their innocence has even been proven. The method of development we are going to use is example. Capital punishment is not an ethical form of punishment, as many innocent people have been and will continue to be wrongly accused and executed. Everyone should have an equal chance to be tried fairly under the law. Human error has to always be taken into account, and this can be seen through the excessive number of false accusations, wrong identifications, and exonerated victims. Since 1973, 187 people who have been sentenced to death have subsequently been exonerated. This in itself is unacceptable, as it can be avoided by simply sentencing criminals to a life sentence without parole instead of killing them. Looking at this through a rule utilitarianist perspective, it is evident that capital punishment is morally wrong because it leads to reduced happiness in society. Capital punishment causes a great deal of irreversible anguish for those who are falsely accused and their families. It also causes distress to the families of victims when it is proven that an innocent person has been executed for a crime they did not commit, and the real culprit has not been brought to justice. True justice has not been served. There are too many people that receive the death penalty for it to cause any happiness in society. Therefore, capital punishment should not be utilized, as innocent individuals are and will continue to be executed wrongfully. If the innocent are killed, in the case of retribution, there is none. How can you have retribution if an innocent person is killed? They should get what they deserve, cannot be utilized if errors in capital punishment persist. The actual criminal has not been brought to justice, therefore the right person did not get what they deserve. Capital punishment denies the due process of law. Its imposition is more often than not arbitrary and always irrevocable. This denies the individuals the opportunity to benefit from potential new evidence or new laws that could warrant the reversal of a conviction or the dissolving of a death sentence. For example, in 2011, the state of Georgia executed Troy Davis, a black man who was almost certainly innocent of the murder of a white-off police officer. The circumstances of his execution raised an international outcry, and for good reason. Davis was convicted based on eyewitness testimony, since there was no murder weapon or physical evidence presented by the prosecution. 7 of the 9 eyewitnesses recanted or contradicted their trial testimony, many of them saying they were pressured or threatened by police at the time. Troy Davis came close to execution 3 previous times because of the difficulty getting to any court to listen to new evidence, casting doubt onto his conviction. After passage of federal law in 1996, petitioners are very limited in their ability to appeal death sentences. and courts routinely refused to hear new testimony, even evidence of the innocent. When Troy Davis finally did get a hearing on his evidence, the judge required proof of innocence, an impossibly high standard which he ruled that Mr. Davis did not meet. Despite the overwhelming call for clemency, supposed to be the fail-safe of the death penalty system, the Georgia Board of Pardons refused to commute the sentence to life, and Mr. Davis was executed. Only one day after Troy Davis was executed, 2 men were freed by the Special Innocence Commission of North Carolina after a decade apiece in prison. The 2 men had actually pled guilty to the crime they did not commit because they were threatened with the death penalty. In 1985 in Maryland, Kirk Bloodsworth was sentenced to death for rape and murder. Despite the testimony of alibi witnesses, in 1986 his conviction was reversed on grounds of withheld evidence pointing to another suspect. He was retried, reconvicted, and sentenced to life in prison. In 1993, newly available DNA evidence proved that he was not a rapist or a killer, and he was released after the prosecution dismissed the case. A year later, he was warranted $300,000 for wrongful punishment. Years later, the DNA was matched to the real killer.
Let me tell you why the death penalty should never be used. The death penalty makes a society more brutal, and it goes against what it's trying to stop in the first place. The death penalty makes a more brutal society. It turns criminals into martyrs, and innocents of judicial error into travesties. Capital punishment brutalizes our society by legitimizing cold-blooded murder as justice for families. Enacting the death penalty shows society that the government can use murder to solve problems that the country has. Furthermore, the change in a person's rights should not be decided based on the whims of the public. It is similar to the current change of laws in abortion in America. The public majority has slightly shifted, and a law can now potentially be put into place that will change a person's rights. There will be a predicted increase in death by 21% once the law is put into place. The law should never negatively affect someone's rights as a human. Using Kant's categorical imperative, creating a universal law that dictates nobody should lose the basic human rights that they have as is a law that everyone can follow and that I'm willing to have everyone do. Therefore, using Kant's categorical imperative and enacting the death penalty would be unethical and cruel to society. A society that respects life does not deliberately kill human beings. An execution is a violent public spectacle of official homicide controlled by the government, and one that endorses killing to solve social problems. The risks of capital punishment far outweigh their benefits. The bloodshed and the resulting destruction of community decency are real. The traditional mode of execution, hanging, is still an option in Delaware, New Hampshire, and Washington. Death on the gallows is easily bungled. If the drop is too short, there will be a slow and agonizing death of suffocation. If the drop is too long, the head will be torn off. In 2 states, Idaho and Utah, still authorize the firing squad. The prisoner is strapped to a chair and hooded. A target is pinned to their chest. 5 marksmen, one with a real bullet, take aim and fire. These actions are not of a humane society, but one that is brutal and cruel. The death penalty should never be used, and the rights of people should never be taken away.
Our third argument: capital punishment is much more expensive to the taxpayer than incarceration. Death penalty case costs through execution were found to have a median cost of $1.26 million. Non-death penalty cases recounted through the end of incarceration were found to have a median cost of $740,000. This extra expense to the taxpayer is not worth the outcome it delivers, and there are also a large number of failed lethal injections which must be seen as inhumane and torturous. Our method of development is example and compare and contrast. Many might believe that the application of capital punishment is more cost-friendly. However, it is in fact the opposite. The death penalty is far more expensive than life without parole sentences. It is estimated that the US taxpayers pay between $50 and $90 million more per year to fund capital punishment rather than just having a life sentence. In Kansas, the defense cost for a death penalty trial averaged about $400,000 per case. The death penalty cost North Carolina $2.16 million per execution over the cost of sentencing murderers to life imprisonment. The bulk of these expenses simply come from trial costs. The death penalty is a waste of taxpayer funds that has no public safety benefit. For example, the cost of convicting and executing Timothy McVeigh for the Oklahoma City bombing was over $13 million. Regardless of moral status, capital punishment, some argue that the waste of executing people caused so much suffering to the condemned person that they will amount to torture, and that it's just wrong. Many methods of execution are quite obviously likely to cause enormous amounts of suffering, such as execution by lethal gas, electrocution, strangulation. Other methods have been abandoned because they were thought to be barbaric, or because they were forced executioners to be too hands-on. These include firing squads and beheading. Utilizing lethal injection has been seen as an ethical way to execute criminals. However, there have been many cases of failed lethal injections and studies that show that lethal injections are not as painless as we believe them to be. According to Kahn's categorical imperative, the use of lethal injections and the risks that are involved with the process would not be willed as universal law, as it kills people slowly and painfully. Here are some accounts of botched lethal injections and evidence that it is a painful death. The latest mode of inflicting the death penalty enacted into law by more than 30 states is lethal injection, first used in 1982 in Texas. It is easy to overstate the humaneness and efficacy of this method. One cannot know whether lethal injection is really painless, and there is evidence that it is not. As the U.S. Court of Appeals observed, there is a substantial and uncontroverted evidence that execution by lethal injection poses a serious risk of cruel, protracted death. Even a slight error in dosage or administration can leave a prisoner conscious but paralyzed while dying, a sentient witness of his or her own asphyxiation. Also, a journalist named Susan Blostein reacted to having witnessed an execution in Texas. She said that the lethal injection method has turned dying into still life, thereby enabling the state to kill without anyone feeling anything. Any remaining glimmers of doubt about whether the man has received due process about his guilt, about our right to take life, cause us to rationalize these deaths with such catchwords as heinous, deserved, deterrent, justice, and painless. We have perfected the art of institutionally killing to the degree that is deadened our natural, quintessentially human response to death. There are also many cases of botched lethal injections. They don't always go to plan. Although the U.S. Supreme Court has held current method of lethal injection used unconstitutional, several people have suffered because of this form of execution. In Ohio, Ronald Broom was subjected to 18 attempts at finding a vein so that he could finally be killed by lethal injection. The process to try and execute him took over 2 hours. Finally, the governor had to stop the execution and grant the inmate 1 week reprieve. Mr. Broom had not been executed because he is challenging the state's right to hold a second execution attempt. Also, convicted murderer Doyle Lee Ham, age 61, was left in agony as executioners repeatedly stabbed a needle into his groin, his ankles, his lower legs for 2.5 hours.
Capital punishment seeks to control people's actions instead of using the death penalty as a deterrence. One of the main arguments for the death penalty is that it is a deterrence for criminals. However, it is seen to not be the case. In the American South, the murder rate is the highest in the country, yet the South also conducts 81% of all executions in America. In fact, with states without the death penalty, the murder rate is much lower. Many of the southern states are also moving to remove the death penalty, such as Colorado in 2020 and Virginia in 2021, completely, and replace the punishment with life in prison. On the other hand, many countries use the death penalty as a form of control over their people. Many countries have different proportionality when it comes to crimes. Due to this, many countries enact the death penalty over non-violent crimes. This includes drug possession, distributed, burglary, blasphemy, political crimes, and adultery. By having such an inconsistent use of the death penalty, the world shows that the authorities in charge of the country get to decide what is acceptable in society and how harsh the punishment should be. For example, on March 15, 2022, the mass execution of 81 people in Saudi Arabia was conducted against charges of terrorism and a vague charge of monitoring and targeting officials and expatriates. The trial case in Saudi Arabia's history of systemic abuse suggests that the trial was unfair and the execution was sped up. This is due to the government's control of the Shia Muslim minority, which was 41 out of the 81 men executed that day. The Shia Muslims have often been systemically oppressed through violence by the Saudi Arabian government. The mass executions were the use of the death penalty to control the actions of people instead of a deterrence. Ethically, this execution of people as a means of control is not right. The death penalty forcibly creates heteronomy of virtuous people. In the case of the mass execution, it stopped the outspoken Shia Muslims from speaking against the Saudi Arabian government, and forced heteronomy on other Shia Muslims in fear that speaking out will give the government a reason to execute them. Instead, without the death penalty, people with virtue ethics will be cultivated, as the people no longer would fear the rules and restrictions over creating a virtuous character.
Our fifth argument: discrimination of marginalized communities plays a crucial and unacceptable role in deciding who receives the death penalty in America. People of color have accounted for a disproportionate 43% of total executions since 1976, and 55% of those currently awaiting execution. A moratorium of death penalty is necessary to address the blatant prejudice in our application of the death penalty. Method of development is example and cause and effect. Since the 1970s, the deep-seated racism within our criminal justice system has become more apparent. The application of the death penalty in capital murder cases has proved to be discriminatory in nature. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, juries in some states are 3 times more likely to hand down a death penalty for a black offender than a white offender. The race of the victim matters as well. A study in North Carolina found that the odds of receiving death penalty rose 3.5 times among those defendants whose victims were white. Finally, the demographics of the death row population show racial bias as well. 42% of the inmates are black, although African Americans only account for 12.5% of the US population. The death penalty violates the constitutional guarantee of equal protection, which states that every individual should have equal protection under the law. Unfortunately, it is applied randomly and discriminatorily. It is imposed disproportionately upon those victims who are white, offenders who are people of color, and those who can't afford protection, and concentrated in certain geographical regions of the country. Also, in recent years, it has been argued that such flagrant discrimination is a thing of the past. However, since the revival of the death penalty in the mid-70s, about half of those on death row at any given time had been black.
Meanwhile,
Still believe that capital punishment is an ethical choice?
No! When is she coming back? When is she coming back?
I want a perfect body. I want a perfect soul. I want you to